calling abortion merely the withholding of support is kind of like suffocating someone with a pillow and calling it the withdrawing of oxygen. There's a whole lot more going on here than just withholding support.
We've got a special episode of the Maven Parent Podcast today. This is actually only the third time that we have invited a guest on to the Maven Parent Podcast. And partly that's because, Erin, you've always said you and I just have so much to share, so much to say, so much wisdom.
I have never uttered those words, but anyway.
Maybe I've thought that. But our guest today is Scott Klusendorf. Scott, thank you for coming on and being part of the podcast here.
Couldn't be happier to be here.
Now, so you're the third guest. I just want you to know how special you are. Actually,
not that special because there's two ahead of me.
Well, because you're our third favorite person.
Okay, all right.
No, Scott is a little background on Scott. Scott is first off, he's a good friend. He's been a friend for years. To Erin and I, we've been ministry partners together. We've worked at an organization, Stand to Reason, together. We've done events together. And when we've needed counsel and advice and marriage counseling, we've gone to him.
Even though I'm only their third best friend. Yeah.
So
After
Scott,
we talked to some other people.
Yeah, some credible people.
Then we're like, well, let's go to Scott.
Yeah.
No, Scott he's a good friend, but he's also a brilliant. I don't want to use that word lightly, but I consider him a brilliant pro-life apologist, but not just a pro-life apologist, but a Christian thinker. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing. If I can be vulnerable here for a moment. No, I'm just kidding. If I can be honest, here's what I notice about Scott. Everybody who knows Scott loves Scott because he's not only a guy who thinks carefully about the faith, he not only advocates for the unborn, he is just a man who loves the Lord and serves the Lord and is a man of character, man of integrity. So all that to say, we should have had you first before the other guests. But you live in Atlanta, Scott, and you're the president of LTI. Tell us about LTI.
Well, Life Training Institute equips Christians to engage the pro-life issue using arguments that don't resonate typically with church people, but do resonate with unchristians. Now, when I say they don't resonate with church people, what I mean is they're not the typical arguments Christians think of for defending the pro-life view. For example, we teach people philosophy and science before we go to Bible verses to defend the pro-life view. That strikes some Christians as kind of odd, but we find that in a culture, as you know, that thinks religious truth doesn't count as real knowledge, we have to start with some place where we can find a common ground launching point for introducing them to the truths of the Christian worldview on the pro-life issue. So we start there.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so I want to mention a couple of things before because you talked about how we have partnered with Scott. And actually, Scott, you're going to be at our Maven conference.
I am.
Next March. So listeners, if you...
February. End of February.
Oh, you're
Maven
right.
Conference.
You're right. Last year we
February.
did March. Okay, so last week in February, Scott, you're going to be
in Southern California.
Speakers. Yes,
at the Maven Conference.
And also a couple months ago, Brett, you and I did an episode on teaching your kids about the pro-life worldview, and we mentioned Scott's resource, The Case for Life. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, go back to that. We recommend Scott's stuff. And then today, we're all here in Manitou Springs at Summit Ministries. Yep. And Scott was here, so we thought we have to use this opportunity to let you guys hear from him on this issue of pro-life apologetics.
Yeah, actually, for those who are watching this on the YouTube channel, that's the explanation for the different background.
Yeah.
It's because we are in Colorado. Summit Ministries is an incredible ministry. If you are a parent and you are not familiar with Summit, go to summit.org. Check out the Worldview conferences they do for high school and college students. They bring in some of the most brilliant faculty in the world to come teach. I taught this morning.
And someday they'll have you, Brett.
Scott taught on Monday. But yeah, great training for young people. That's why they bring in guys like Scott.
Okay, so we know you, Scott, but we do want our listeners to get to know you a little bit before we start talking about the pro-life movement and what's been going on in the Supreme Court and everything that you can help us think through. So start with, I mean, we know you're a father and a husband, but even start before that. What kind of home did you grow up in? And then kind of walk us through how you got involved in the whole pro-life movement.
Yeah, I was raised actually in a Seventh-day Adventist home. So
Really?
a home that put a lot of focus on rule keeping. Not that my parents were overbearing. They weren't, but the church we attended tended to be very legalistic, tended to focus more on doing the right things than what it means to live under a covenant of grace. And so I was raised in that. I went to Adventist Academy, K through 12. But it was interesting. In high school, I figured out through God's gracious providence that Adventists were mistaken on justification, meaning how we get right with God. In other words, Christ cannot pay for our sins once and for all and still be in the heavenlies doing an investigative judgment of the righteous people. That just doesn't work. Those two things don't fit together. So I became a Christian in high school while attending Adventist Academy, while attending an Adventist church. And then shortly thereafter, I wandered across the street to a tiny little church in Van Nuys, California of 10,000 people, a church known as the Church on the Way, pastored by a guy named Jack Hayford. And while I was there in their college group, one day, our college pastor was up there teaching, and he was deep into his sermon, and there's 500 students in this college group. And he just suddenly stops, and he looks out over the crowd, and he says, tips his glasses down and goes, "I don't know half of you, and I'll bet you don't know each other. I'm just going to stop right here for a minute. I want you to go find somebody you've never said hello to in this class and go introduce yourself." Well, I thought, okay. I looked to my right, and I saw a very nice-looking young woman and thought, I just heard from my college pastor that it is the word of the Lord to go meet this young woman. So I went over and met her and talked to her, and, well, we've been talking ever since because we are celebrating 37 years of marriage this year.
That's
Wow.
awesome.
So that's how I met Stephanie. And shortly after that, I finished up at UCLA and then became a youth pastor. And it was during that time that I got drawn into the pro-life cause. That was the time period where God arrested me. I had always been pro-life, but I had never really begun to act like I was pro-life. What I said and what I did were not matched. And so I went to a pro-life breakfast for pastors where I thought there'd be a lot of pastors there. And the director of the local pregnancy center was wonderful. She kept bugging me to get involved and saying, "Hey, you got to come to our events." And I'd be, yeah, sure. And I'd show up at their banquet once a year, give an obligatory $100 and go home and think, okay, I did my pro-life thing. Well, she invited me to this breakfast. Only 4 other pastors showed up. There should have been 100. And 4 pastors, their wives, and me. And thankfully, the speaker, a guy named Greg Cunningham, laid out a case for the pro-life view. And I thought, boy, I like this guy. He doesn't hurt the brain to listen to. He's intelligent. But that's not what changed me. About halfway through his talk, he showed an 8-minute video depicting abortion. I had never seen it. And it absolutely floored me. And I sat there and I wept and I thought, I am no different than the priest and the Levite. And I say I care about this issue, but I don't act like it. I pass by on the other side of the road. And I went home to Stephanie and said, you got to see this. And I took this VHS tape he showed. This was November of 1990. By the way, VHS tapes were these rectangular things, in case your listeners are wondering what those are.
Yeah.
And I showed it to her and said, honey, I think my whole life's been interrupted. And sure enough, 6 months later, with the blessing of my church, I left to pursue teaching Christians how to make a case for the pro-life view. So that's a very fast-forward version of my timeline, but I'll go back and talk about any part of that you want.
Well, I'm curious politically what was going on at that time, kind of maybe we do have some young parents who listen who maybe were kids in the 90s.
Yeah.
But so what politically was going on? And then what was it? What was the catalyst for you that made you think, okay, I need to devote my time to this, to training Christians to think about it? Was it just your own experience, or were you seeing, well, maybe it was that meeting where 4 pastors come. But anyway, so kind of political, cultural climate
Yeah.
at that time with abortion?
Good question. Well, this was 1990, so it was 2 years before the Casey decision that pro-lifers were convinced at the time was going to overturn Roe v. Wade. They were absolutely convinced of it. In fact, it was a done deal. This is in the bag. We can even, light the cigars right now and celebrate. At least the bad Christians lit cigars. But anyway, they were sure they had this. And of course, it went the other way. And now you have a dispirited movement that is literally in shambles. And people didn't know what to do. And by 1992, it was apparent to me that if we didn't start from our foundations and begin equipping Christians, we were going to lose this fight. Because as I looked around, our problem wasn't that we had a public opinion poll problem only, or that we had a press problem only, or that we had a silent pulpit problem only. Our problem was huge numbers of people disagreed with us on the worldview question of what makes humans valuable in the first place. And if I did not start there with engaging the culture, the political stuff was never going to come around. So that's what kind of just, I'd wake up every morning thinking, I got to do something to address this. It would drive me. And I read everything I could get my hands on. This was pre-internet. So I'd go down to the UCLA Research Library and bury myself in microfiche. Nobody knows what that is anymore. It's not actual fish that swim. It's stuff on this. You'd look at this little camera that would magnify text that had been recorded on these weird things called microfiche, and old journal articles. I mean, anything I could get my hands on to just read and become up to date on the issue. And I think, honestly, Erin, the politics of the day, seeing the despair of the movement after the Casey decision really drove me to want to make a difference. That and the fact that I had some really good mentors like Greg Cunningham that said, let me tell you what's really happening in the culture right now. And they understood the moment. And that helped.
Yeah.
And so, and with this issue of abortion, I mean, I think sometimes we think, oh, that's a kind of the single issue, and we kind of don't realize the implications of that issue for the larger culture.
Right.
And I think sometimes, Christians think that, well, it's just abortion that's the issue, and they don't realize that there are deeper underlying issues, and that's why this issue is so significant.
Yeah.
Talking about the value of life and those kind of things. And so your work is not, it doesn't just have a direct impact on abortion.
Right.
But there's other implications.
There are. For example, if you believe that human beings have no intrinsic value, that they're just cosmic accidents that came from nothing and were caused by nothing, you're also going to believe that at death, there's no consequences for your life here on earth, which means talk of heaven and hell are meaningless to you. Our anthropology, how we view what makes humans valuable in the first place and what gives us our dignity, whether it's a performance-based foundation that says we only have dignity because of what we can do functionally, or it's an endowment view that says we have value simply because of whose image we bear, has a direct impact on how we view eternity. These are evangelistic issues. It works both ways. Christians tend to think, oh, it's always only a one-way street. If you are an atheist, you can't have any grounding for anything like human value. Well, that's true. But if you also believe going the other direction, that there's nothing special about being human, you're also going to think then, well, there's no God that I have to be accountable to. So it goes both ways. And I think we need to understand that abortion is not a distraction to our Christian witness. It actually is right at the heart of it, both practically and theologically. I just got done talking an hour ago at Summit, where you and I have been ministering the last 2 days. And a student comes up to me at lunch and he starts talking to me about why he's an atheist. And we worked through his objections, and I started to notice that he seemed to fold rather quickly. And I'm thinking, okay, well, doesn't seem to be too problematic. And finally he says, well, thank you. And he gets up to leave, and then he comes back and says, oh, by the way. And I'm thinking, this is going to be a big by the way. My girlfriend is pregnant. She's a month and a half along. My parents don't know. Her parents don't know. And when I get home from Summit, I have to tell them. And I don't know what to do. Now, any pastor or church leader that thinks these kinds of stories aren't happening in their churches has blinders on. These issues relate to our ministry.
Yeah.
And I think what opened him up to telling me that at the end is the last part of our conversation prior to it. When we talked about abortion, I also linked it to the gospel, and I talked about the need for the church to embrace post-abortion people, embrace people who face crisis pregnancy centers, and our churches should welcome these people and not throw them out. And he was astounded because his church wasn't like that. And I think it was hearing that the gospel had room enough to accommodate someone like him, gave him the permission to tell me what he was really going through and what he really wanted to tell me all along.
Yeah. And so there are huge worldview implications
Yeah.
that come with this issue. And this is one reason, and we talk about it all the time on the podcast for parents, is worldview is so vital
Absolutely.
in terms of discipling our kids.
Yes.
And so it's not just this one quote unquote political issue. There is a whole worldview that frames the way that we think about these things. There's implications for other issues, and and what we do on an issue like this maybe sometimes helps reveal to us whether or not we have a fully
Yes.
robust Christian worldview.
Yes.
Now you got kids,
Yes.
Scott. Tell us about your kids.
We got 4. So we got a son, 32. He lives in Salt Lake. He works for Lockheed. He's working the F-35 fighters and doing all the IT fly-by wiring for those guys. He's making more money than me, so I don't pay to fly him home for Christmas anymore. We're done with those days. We have a son, 30, who lives locally. We have a son, 25, who also lives locally. He's also in IT. And we have our daughter, Emily, who is 21 and a senior at Grove City College, studying English like her dad.
Oh.
Nice.
But also theater, unlike her dad.
Okay, so knowing you're a dad and thinking about even this student you talked
Yeah.
to, and I mean, we talk a lot on the podcast. The episode we did about teaching your kids the pro-life movement, and about the pro-life movement and this topic of abortion, but we talked about how early that starts because you are laying this foundation of Genesis 1, that we are made in God's image.
Yes.
And only the Christian worldview gives us this identity that you can't get in any other thing. Our identity comes from God because we were made by him.
Yes.
And we bear his image. And so the implications of that are huge. We'll walk our kids through that as they grow, but it actually starts so young. So I'm just so curious to know, how did you and Stephanie, in your discipleship of your kids, and knowing this was such an important, this was your ministry in your life and what you were doing, but did you shy away from introducing your kids to abortion till they were teenagers? Or how did you kind of make this worldview a part of what you did, you and Stephanie, both as you raised your kids?
I like how you both are framing this, that the abortion issue is situated within a larger worldview, what we're calling here the Christian worldview. So we always tried to teach it within that context. So we did it 2 ways. We certainly were age sensitive. So we did not take our 9-year-old and show them an abortion video and say, you need to be opposed to this. We didn't do that, but we did talk about what it means to have value and where our value comes from. It does not come from our performance. It comes from whose image we bear. We certainly taught that. We then, when they got into the teenage years, I did 2 things to try to sneak this in on them in a more agreeable fashion. So the first thing I did is when they turned 14 and 15 respectively, the 2 oldest boys, I paid them to go through a Christian apologetics program with me. Instead of having them get part-time jobs at Kroger, which they could have done starting at age 14, I said, listen, instead of you doing that, I'm going to pay you to go through a summer of apologetics. You're going to get up. We're going to start at 9 a.m. every day, go to 1, and then in the evening we'll watch videos. So we did a lot of things. We went through a lot of the Stand to Reason curriculum. We went through some of the pro-life curriculum. We would watch debates with William Lane Craig and have discussions about them. And another parent in the church heard about this and said, can my son join you? So he jumped in and they paid him. And so, I had a couple of parents frown at me. Well, I think that's bad. I said, wait a minute. what is more important, my kid learning to bag groceries or learning a credible foundation for his faith? So they didn't get rich off this, but it was a way to incite them to do it. And then the next summer, I did something else. I said, listen, we're going to go on a mission trip to the Dominican Republic. And I had a friend there who was running YWAM for the whole Caribbean region. And he said, hey, come on down, bring your sons. Well, that parent that was in the original apologetics group heard of it, and now 2 other friends heard about it. Now I've got a team of 5 teenage boys I'm taking down there. And I said, okay, we're going to go. But to prepare, we're going to do 6 months of training to get ready for it. Mm-hmm. So we studied evangelism. We studied what is the gospel. We studied, just giving them the basics to get ready so that when they encountered people, they could say it. Now, I knew that going down there, most of the work they'd be doing would be service-oriented, but it became the perfect pretext for teaching them what they believe. And so that's how we kind of chose to do it, is parents look for those opportunities where we could train them with a task in view.
Yeah. Oh, I love the intentionality of that. And I think, we talk a lot about how a lot of the ways we teach is just through living life and narrating. Yeah. And I know you did that with your kids, but also it is important to have intentional times where you carve it out, you remove distractions, and you say, hey, this is valuable and this is important, and it's going to help you to develop a Christian worldview. And what's more important than that? And so it's worth devoting our summer to, or whatever scenario.
You couldn't be more right, Erin. And here's the other thing. The church we were attending at the time was not teaching our kids these things. So they're going to get it from me, or they ain't getting it. So we felt like, okay, we need to catechize this. We need to systematize it. You're right. That's no substitute for living it out consistently in the family, as imperfectly as we all do that.
Yes.
But there's something to be said for systematic training, and it gets stuff into them. And I happen to believe it sticks around.
Yeah. Well, it exposes them to ideas. It shows them there are good reasons to believe what we believe. Of course, at the age you're talking about too, we talk about the stages with our kids, and especially those teenage years, they have lots of questions. They're thinking through these big ideas of life. And when, as parents or the church says, hey, we're not afraid to talk about these, bring your objections, bring your questions. And 6 months, to prepare for a trip where you want them to go and serve, but not just to feel better about themselves for volunteering, but to look at the people they're serving in a different way.
Yeah.
And to see even the act of service in a different way. So I hope people are encouraged by that. And actually the kid jumping into your group and then you taking is actually, I hope, something that people listening would think, okay, I could actually do this with like-minded parents.
Absolutely.
I don't have to. I'm not Scott Klusendorf. I can't teach a whole thing. Okay, fine. So work together, and maybe each parent could take a topic or an issue, or maybe there is one parent who's passionate about it, and you can encourage them and help them to, in the church or in your neighborhood.
Exactly right.
Take this on.
They don't need to teach the whole thing. They just need to facilitate it.
Yeah.
And that's it. And by the way, I handed the ball off. There was a local youth pastor that the kids respected who really knew his stuff apologetically. And he'd come in and talk to them, and it was great. It was wonderful. And we had another guy that was very pastoral but still knew his stuff, and they got to learn from him. You don't have to do it all. You just have to be willing to get it rolling.
Yeah, and places like Summit are a great place to get that supplemental training for parents who are like, hey, I need allies in this.
Yeah.
So, okay, Scott, so tell us a little bit more about LTI and what you're doing in your organization to equip the church on this issue.
Well, we do 2 things. The first thing we do that's different than other pro-life organizations, we're very targeted in our messaging. We don't talk about abstinence. We don't talk about sexual purity. We don't talk about post-abortion regret. Now, all of those things are absolutely essential, so don't hear me wrong on this. But we recognized right out of the gate, nobody was teaching systematic pro-life apologetics specifically to students in a way that would help them learn to communicate those ideas to others. So we thought, okay, we can do that one thing better than anybody else. We can't do better on pregnancy center work. We can't do better on evangelism. We're not going to be general Christian apologetics, We're not going to beat Brett Kunkel on the issue of doubt, nor do we want to. But we can certainly be the best in the business at what we do. And so we would target, the second thing we did is we decided that rather than try to build our own conferences, because we just didn't have the staff for that, what we would do is we would go to captive audiences and get our speakers into those venues. So places like large Catholic high schools, evangelical high schools, Christian college chapels. And we send our team out of speakers. There's 5 of us. And we go and do those kinds of events. And now we're getting more involved online as well. But our idea there was 2 things: a narrow messaging on the apologetics of the pro-life view, and then secondly, captive audience strategy. And that enabled us to just kind of keep the main thing.
Yeah.
And the website?
Our website is prolifetraining.com.
Okay,
I almost forgot it. I just about, what I almost said? str.org. Now, that's a good website.
Hey,
people should go there.
Greg Kokel would have thanked you.
Yes.
Prolifetraining.org.
.com.
.com.
Prolifetraining.com.
And we want people to go there, find out more about what you're doing, and even think about, hey, in your church or in your youth group or your Christian school, bring out an LTI speaker because, Scott is recognized by many people as, and my view, my personal view is that Scott's the best pro-life speaker out there, most effective training, all the stuff that I've really learned on this issue. I mean, you've been a huge mentor on this, and I basically just steal your material and teach it.
That's what it's there for.
Exactly. And so, it's just so effective. And so I want parents out there or youth pastors or whoever's listening to, we need this kind of training for our young people. When I was a youth pastor, I would do this training with our youth group all the time. It's such an important issue. But speak to the parent out there who maybe hasn't bought into that yet. They think, wow, okay, Christians seem to make this a big issue, but I'm not convinced that it's all that big of an issue.
Yeah. Well, let me say this to any parent that might be wondering, does this matter? I want you to think about that student I just talked to an hour ago at Summit. His parents don't know what I know. His pastor doesn't know what I know. The girl's parents, who are Christian, do not know what I know. But yet his story and her story is happening in churches all over the nation. And this shouldn't surprise us. If we truly understand the gospel, it shouldn't surprise us one bit that these things happen. I think we want a gospel that is so neat and so tidy that we can say that, oh, you know what? Our kids have been delivered from everything that could possibly be evil and wrong. And once they become Christians, it's one perfect, neat story from beginning to end. And we've bought into this testimony culture that says there's no hiccups along the way. And that's just not how this is lived out. And one of the hiccups that young people encounter has to do with choices they make on unplanned pregnancies and on abortion. And if our churches are not equipping our kids to think biblically with a gospel-centered contextual worldview, we shouldn't be surprised when their kids don't know what to do when they face a situation like the one I just described. But secondly, parents, let me tell you this. Also in our churches are millions of fellow believers who have a ghost of a dead child in their background that is keeping them from full fellowship with Christ. And it's not because abortion is a sin that Jesus can't forgive. The problem is these precious people have convinced themselves they've done something that just somehow seems like even if God forgives them, they can never be all that God would want them to be. They can never have a profound ministry because of what they've done. And a fully formed biblical worldview on abortion would recognize that people that have sinned on the issue of abortion are no more alienated from God's grace than any of us are. We all are rebels. We all have turned against our Maker. Our stories are not one neat line from beginning, from conversion till the day we drop. No, they're messed up stories where God continually gives us grace to keep moving forward. And I think it's our fear that if we talk about abortion, somehow it'll look like our Christianity is too messy. No, what we ought to do is recognize there's desperate people in our churches who long to be free, who aren't free because we're not talking about the issue that's keeping them enslaved. And the kindest thing we can do is talk truthfully about abortion so that people who've been wounded by it can be brought out of denial and into confession so they can find healing and fellowship with Christ. So I tell pastors, I tell parents, look, this is not an issue for us to sweep under the rug. At a very practical level, at the deepest spiritual level, we need to talk about this. There's only one antidote for the shedding of innocent blood, and that was the shedding of innocent blood that Jesus provided for us on the cross. And that message needs to be communicated to the church family.
I appreciate that. As a parent, thinking about how, like what you said, we want our kids' lives to be just very simple and easy. We would like, I know as a mom, I would just love if my kids don't have to struggle or have any kind of hardship. And even though I know, looking back on my own life, of course, the hardships is what helped me to grow. But really, if we're thinking of it that way, we're not having a true picture of reality and a true picture of the gospel.
Yeah.
And so that reminder that sometimes we need to remind ourselves of the gospel when it comes to our own kids. Yeah. And that there's going to be hiccups along the way.
There is.
And
isn't it I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but isn't it a jaw-dropping moment in your parenting experience when it dawns on you can't save your kids?
Yes.
And I think so often one of the reasons we don't want to talk about issues like abortion or gay marriage or these terrible things we see going in the culture, we're thinking, okay, we can save our kids from these things. And the reason why we think we can save them from those things is we've bought into a faulty underlying belief that says we can save them ultimately. And the truth is, at the end of the day, they're going to fly with their own wings. We do the best we can and pray that in God's providence, He does the work of salvation in them. But it is a humbling and yet freeing thing to realize that all we can do is, imperfect as we are as parents, and I'm by no means a perfect parent any more than the next guy, but at least Stephanie and I can look at each other and say, okay, as imperfect as it may have been, we did try to systematically expose kids to a Christian worldview. And that's had some wonderful benefits, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, at the end of the day, even that isn't what's going to save them. It's God who's going to save them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I love the way that you just communicated all of that. You see how the worldview is a part of this issue. Gospel is part of this issue.
Yes.
It's not just this single issue abortion that's disconnected from all this other stuff. And it's actually the Christian worldview or Christianity that provides not only the sense of justice on this issue and advocating for the unborn and doing what's right, but then it also is Christianity that comes in and says, and yes, in a broken, messed up world, there's also forgiveness, redemption, all of that. And this is why this is such an important issue.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we want to maybe get a little, we've got the pro-life expert here. You obviously watch the culture and what's going on. And we had the recent Dobbs decision that was handed down.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just talk to the kind of the mom and dad who aren't in this, like, we are in this and watching the culture. What is it that a parent should be thinking about in regards to this decision and the implications for us as a church, and maybe, where do we go from here?
Yeah. Let me give you what I think pro-life parents need to do in a post-Roe v. Wade world? What are 5 or 6 things parents can do who are pro-life that want to seize the moment, okay? So the first thing they need to do is teach their kids to argue well. Now, you do a great job, Brett, talking about this when you talk to students about why Jesus matters, and you do a good job of helping them expose things like the genetic fallacy and the non sequitur problem, where people bring up objections that don't follow from what the issue is at hand. And one of the things that's happening in America today is that people are not arguing about abortion. They think they are, but they're not. The problem is they're not formally arguing. And they're not engaging arguments. They're just shouting slogans and trying to shut people up. That's not arguing. That's censorship as far as I'm concerned. So we need to teach our kids to argue well. They need to understand a formal pro-life argument. And that pro-life argument is very simple. Premise 1, it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Premise 2, abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Conclusion, therefore, abortion's wrong. Now, as you and I know, that argument stands unless you can do one of 3 things. Show it's invalid, meaning the conclusion doesn't follow. Show it's unsound, meaning one or more of the premises is untrue. Or show that the terms are used in an unclear or equivocal fashion. Outside of that, the argument stands. And our kids need to know that when critics attack them for their pro-life view, unless the critics are doing one of those 3 things, their case is good. They should stand on it and not be intimidated. So we need to teach our kids to argue well as pro-life parents. The second thing we need to do is equip our kids to dispel misconceptions. The untruths are just flying right now. After Dobbs, literally within hours, I'm talking, the ink wasn't even dry on the decision, right? And already we're hearing things like this. Well, women now who suffer miscarriage are going to go to prison for life because they're going to have to prove they didn't have an abortion. Oh, women who have ectopic pregnancies aren't going to be able to get life-saving surgery. They're going to be forced to die because of this decision. You've heard all this that's been going on. Well, we need to be able to say, wait a minute, that is absolutely untrue. And it is untrue. I've read every state law on abortion. There's not one state anywhere that says a woman with an ectopic pregnancy cannot get life-saving surgery. There's not one state bill that says if she has a miscarriage, she has to prove she didn't have an abortion. These are flat-out lies, and if Christians do not address them, they're not going to get addressed. Parents, we got to equip our kids to be truth tellers because their friends are believing these lies. Students here at Summit were believing these lies, and we address them. We talked about them yesterday. The third thing pro-life parents need to do, and this is something I think a lot of parents don't think about. They need to help establish pro-life churches. And an effective pro-life church is going to do 4 things. Number 1, it's going to preach, teach, and counsel a biblical view of human value, that we are valuable because of whose image we bear, not because of our performance. Secondly, that church needs to preach, teach, and counsel that abortion is a sin and do it truthfully. Thirdly, and this is key, that church needs to preach, teach, and counsel a Christ-centered gospel that heals wounded men and women who've participated in abortion. And then the fourth one, which you and I are in the business of, is equipping its own people to convey a pro-life message to a culture that is unchurched. And those 4 things mark a pro-life church. That's what a pro-life church does, in addition to what most churches do, assist the local pregnancy center. And then the final thing that churches need to do is they need to begin systematically training full-time apologists. Churches love to send out missionaries. They love to say, hey, we're going to support and train somebody to go to Africa for 10 years. Okay, let's keep doing that. But quite frankly, I'm beginning to wonder if Africa might be more spiritual than America is right now. And I think we need to think about how do we equip apologists to invest vocationally in pro-life work. And these are things parents can begin planting seeds in their kids' mind for.
Yeah.
Well, your encouragement to help your kids learn how to argue, my first thought was like, well, that's dangerous. Because
they do that pretty well already, right?
Yeah. If you've been a parent long enough to have a 12, 13-year-old, you realize, they like to argue.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about, training them to argue, is the distinction that's important, and actually we need to engage in, and even to think about our own kids and thinking about sending them out, training them as missionaries in the pro-life movement, I think is actually an exciting thing to think about, and how our training through the years can do that we could actually send out our kids into the culture, even if they become full-time businessmen or women, or do all kinds of things, or maybe they do become people who, like LTI does, and thinking about the younger generation and wanting to help them think through it and making the case in schools and all of these things. I mean, it's actually exciting to think about having the goal that we want to send our kids out to a lost and dying culture.
Yeah.
And with the Christian worldview of life, and that our kids would be people that in their businesses, in their cubicles, at their lunchtime, in their college campus, that they are prepared to argue in the true good sense.
In the good sense.
To make an argument for the pro-life
You can make the
cause.
distinction between arguing and being argumentative.
Yes.
Right. Kids are naturally argumentative. But
Yeah.
actually, if you teach them to argue well or reason well, it actually increases, or it can increase the productivity of your conversations with them. You can have actually better conversations with them where they're reasonable conversations with your kids.
That's right.
And that's what we've done with our kids, where we've said, hey, if you don't, ever agree with something mom and dad have said, or a rule that we have, you are always able to dispute that. Open door policy, come talk to us about it. But here's what you have to do. You have to give us reasons why you think this is a bad idea.
Yeah.
And you have to listen to our reasons why we think it is a good idea. And then let's discuss it. And then that leads to a much more productive conversation.
That's right.
So
That's right.
And it's the difference. I mean, of course we have things we want to teach our children. Of course, we want to teach them the Christian worldview because it's true.
Right.
And it's the true picture of reality. But we want to teach them how to think, so that when they go on the college campus or in their workplace and they're getting ideas from other people, well, they know how to argue through an idea.
That's right.
They know how to think through it. And that's equipping our kids in a way that we want to equip them.
So let's do that a little bit here. So before we wrap up here,
Okay.
let's throw out a few. I want to throw out some of the kind of common things that you hear from non-Christians and Christians, and you give us kind of your quick response on this. Okay, so one of the biggest slogans that you hear hurled at pro-lifers is, "Hey, my body, my choice."
Yeah.
And that's supposed to be a conversation stopper. How do you respond? How do we teach our kids to respond to something like that?
Well, first of all, recognize that's really not an argument. That's an assertion. Nothing's been argued there. You've just asserted something. So who bears the burden of proof when an assertion is made, the listener or the speaker? Well, obviously, the person making the claim. So that's the first thing. But if I were going to engage the assertion, I'd first want to know who's making it. At the street level, it's a very easy thing to dispute. Obviously, the unborn has its own DNA. It's often its own blood type, is at least half the time a different gender than its mother. We can take a white embryo conceived in a test tube, implant it in a black woman, and it's going to be born white. We know conclusively it's not part of her body. But there's a more sophisticated argument that is basically saying that because I am sovereign over my body, I can do whatever I want with what resides in it. It's a more academic argument that says just because you're human and have a right to life doesn't mean you can use my body to support your own life. I can withhold that support if I want. But the problem with that argument in very quick form is abortion is much more than withholding support. It's intentionally killing another human being through dismemberment, poisoning, and whatever. Suppose I have a fatal kidney ailment and I need your blood type in a transfusion to save my life. Let's say you decline. You say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to withhold supporting you. All right, let's say that's fine. It doesn't follow from that you can slit my throat in the name of withholding support. Yeah. Frank Beckwith, our friend, puts it real well. Calling abortion merely the withholding of support is kind of like suffocating someone with a pillow and calling it the withdrawing of oxygen. There's a whole lot more going on here than just withholding support.
Yeah.
So,
okay. You got one?
Yeah. What about the one that I especially since Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
I have heard this over and over again from, I think, well-meaning Christians. But okay, now that Roe v. Wade has passed, Christians, we got to get serious about loving people, as if we weren't doing that already. But this whole idea that Christians, okay, we were just about the abortion thing. Not that abortion is illegal now in the country. We know
Right.
that distinction. But so what do you say to Christians only care about this abortion issue? It's like a hang up we have. And then after the baby's born, Christians don't care.
You're pro-life, not whole life.
Pro-life,
Yeah,
not
you're
whole
pro-birth, not pro-life,
That's
or
right.
Yes,
something like
yes,
that. Yeah. Well, first of all, let's just factually dispel the lie.
life. Yes.
Pro-life Christians do care. Pro-life pregnancy centers outnumber abortion clinics 3-1 in this country, and they're supported by conservative pro-life families who get no help from the government funding the ministries of these medical clinics now that serve this woman both before and after birth. So let's just dispel that myth. But let's back up and just look at this philosophically for a moment. How does it follow that because you oppose the intentional killing of an innocent human being, you have to fix everything wrong with society? Imagine saying to a fireman who rescues your kid from a burning building, what are you going to do to pay for his education? What are you going to do to help him have good clothes? What are you doing to make sure he gets in a good career? I mean, nobody would say that. We'd recognize that the fireman had a specific job, save the immediate life at hand. But with pro-lifers, we say to them, oh, if you're going to save these children from being butchered, you have to now take responsibility for them, womb to tomb. Okay, that's just utterly fallacious. And no other ministry is asked to do that. People who rescue women from sex trafficking are not told, well, what are you going to do to make sure that woman gets all the counseling she needs? What are you going to do to pay for her schooling? What are you going to do to make sure she gets a career so she's never trafficked again? No, it's only pro-lifers who get hit with this nonsense. And it's garbage. It's factually untrue. And I refuse to accept the premise that because I oppose the intentional killing of an innocent human being, I got to fix everything wrong. By the way, the people who raise these objections, they're not going to convert to being pro-life, even if we did everything they demanded. It's one big smokescreen. It's a way to avoid the fact that they don't want to be pro-life. So they're going to throw out the smokescreen and say, well, you're not a pro-life to begin with, so I don't have to be either.
Yeah. And I mean, the Christian worldview, right, says that everybody's made in God's image,
Yes.
has dignity and value. And so that informs our ethic and what we do.
Yes.
And you're going to see, and so what we should expect is that Christians will be taking care of other
Sure.
people, the needs of other people, all through all different stages of life, and that's exactly what we see. I mean, we see Christians consistently living that out.
Here's the thing. It's one thing to say that as pro-life Christians, we will care about a lot of issues. We should. Okay, I'm a pro-life apologist, but guess what? We donate to other causes. We donate to alleviate poverty. We have donated to challenge sex trafficking. We have donated to a wide variety of issues. But it doesn't follow that the operational objectives of the pro-life movement have to be broad and inclusive. Any more than it would be reasonable to say to the American Cancer Society, you're not a true medical organization because you only treat one disease and not many. What are you doing about lupus? What are you doing about diabetes? What are you doing about heart disease and Crohn's disease and Lyme's disease? I mean, nobody would say that to the American Cancer Society. But again, they're going to say it to pro-lifers.
Yeah.
And it's a bunch of bunk.
Yeah, and I want to point out to people what you just did there. I mean, that if you have teenagers at home maybe who have been swayed on this issue of abortion, what you just did is give counter examples of are you logically consistent with that idea?
Yeah.
And that's such a good strategy to do with not only people we're in conversation with, but even maybe with our own kids of saying, does this follow in every area? And giving those examples as you're talking, it's so obvious that is a burden we don't put on any other cause.
No.
And so why would we put that on and how you said, well, I just don't accept that conclusion. We can say that and we can model that for our kids. Well, you're just making an assertion. You have to give good reasons for it, or I'm going to give you some counter examples where that doesn't follow.
Exactly.
So it's so good to even I just wanted to even point that out on what Scott's doing there.
Well, there's so much more that we could talk about on this, and actually, thankfully, Scott's written a book. Tell us about the book. Say the parents out there saying, "Okay, I need to get equipped on this issue. I need to think more carefully so I can train up my kids." What are the resources out there?
Well, they can get my book, The Case for Life, published by Crossway. And by the way, a second edition of that book is coming out in May of next year.
Oh,
I've turned in the finished manuscript. Now,
Great.
Here's the thing about the new book. Sorry, shameless plug here. If you already have the original Case for Life,
we do.
the second edition has 8 new chapters.
Oh, great.
And 44% new content. So it's not a rehash. It is substantially rewritten. And in addition to the 8 new chapters, 4 additional chapters that are retained from the original book are so rewritten, they're almost new chapters. So we're talking 12 new chapters almost of material. And I am very excited. It takes a deep dive into the worldview behind abortion thinking, which is going to be instructive parents not only on the abortion issue, but on your defense of theism in general and the Christian worldview in general. There's a chapter on how do we approach the deep thinkers on the other side. Who are the major players? What are their arguments and how can we answer them? So it looks at that. That's all new. That's all new material. There's a whole chapter on what it means to be pro-life, answering this whole idea that, if you don't take on every issue, you're not really pro-life. And a whole thing on what a pro-life church looks like. So parents, I think there'll be some good stuff.
So here's
in
the strategy. Get The Case for Life now.
Yeah.
Read the first edition, and then next May,
Read the second.
The next book comes out. Read the second one, and you'll be well equipped.
Yeah.
Well, this is such an important issue. I actually, there's a lot of talk about social justice in the church. In my view, this is the most important social justice issue of our time. And it's a true social justice issue. A lot of issues get thrown under there that aren't actually justice issues. This is a justice issue.
Yeah.
This is, where innocent
Yes.
human beings' lives are at stake. And so this is something that we as believers must, if we care anything about justice, we must care about this
Now,
issue.
of course, Brett, there will be the pushback. There'll be people say, well, abortion isn't the only issue. And they're right. Of course it isn't. It's not the only issue any more than freeing the slaves was the only issue in 1860 or saving Jews was the only issue in 1940. But both issues were the dominant issues of their day.
Yeah.
And pro-life Christians are right to focus on those dominant issues. And then another thing you'll get people who will say things like, well, there are other issues that are equally important. Wait a minute. Okay. Let's say we have a candidate for president who has a great healthcare program, great education program, has a great plan for economic opportunity, but he wants to make sure it's legal to beat your spouse. His negative invalidates his positives.
Yep.
And you don't say, well, he's good on these 3 things. He's only bad on one issue. No, that one bad issue is an intrinsic evil. We do not affirm an intrinsic evil because somebody's going to help us with a contingent one. We recognize the issue here. And a lot of Christians lump all these issues together as if they're equally weighted, and they're not.
Yeah.
They're not. Yeah. The cliche that all sin is not a biblical truth. Some sins are worse than others.
Yep, that's right. And Scott, you've helped us to think carefully through these issues. In fact, here's the good news for those of you who have come to the Maven conference, or for those who haven't yet. Next February, last week in February, Scott's going to be one of our speakers at the Maven conference, and he's going to address this issue, give us further training, some other things as well. And so we're privileged to have him out here in Southern California, I guess out there in Southern California next February. So you'll get a lot more of Scott and just the amazing training that we're getting here today. So thank you, Scott, for hanging out with us.
Looking forward to it. I got to be at your first Maven concert. I feel honored. Even though I'm only your 3rd best person, I got to be at your first conference.
Yes, you were top of our list.
Yeah, okay. Well, Scott, we're moving you up. We're moving you up in that list.
Upgrade.
So upgrade. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you, Scott.
Well, thank you. Great to be with you both.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.